It was sweltering even in the shade. Summer had squeezed the last drops of patience out of people, and the city swimming pool was the only place of escape from the scorching sun. The ringing voices of children, the splashing of water, and laughter could be heard everywhere. Mothers were chatting on deck chairs, looking at their children, and teenagers were noisily running along the boards, despite the forbidden signs. It seemed like an ordinary summer day. There was a middle-aged man sitting on the edge of the pool, in the shade of an umbrella. His name was Greg, and he was someone people used to avoid. Not because of his looks. He looked like a typical average guy, tanned face, plaid-patterned shorts, and a crumpled baseball cap. It was all about his eyes. They glided over his surroundings like a hunter scoping out prey. A cold, dismissive stare that was always looking for someone to focus on. Greg watched the pool intently. Mostly those he considered inappropriate in this place. When a full black girl appeared on the horizon, he immediately felt a surge of irritation. The girl did not rush into the water. She stood unassumingly beside her mother, holding a towel and shying away from the gaze of others. Her mother was a confident and bright woman, but her daughter, on the contrary, looked like the embodiment of shyness. Greg smirked. How else are they fat and bulky, he thought as he watched the girl tread carefully with bare feet on the hot concrete. No wonder they take up so much space. Will they fit in the pool, or will the water go over the sides? He hummed softly, looking at her awkwardness. The girl tripped over the edge of the chaise lounge, and the towel fell to the ground. Greg looked around quickly, checking to see if anyone had noticed his reaction. His face spread into a snide smile as he heard her awkwardly apologize to strangers, hitting them by accident. And what do they come here for anyway? He muttered under his breath. They belong somewhere far away, in their dirty neighborhoods. The pool isn't for them. The girl finally decided to approach the water. She took a deep breath, trying to ignore the hard stare she felt in the back of her head. Her mother smiled encouragingly at her, but it didn't help. Greg coughed loudly, drawing the attention of those around him, and then said mockingly, "That'll be a wave if she jumps. I think I'll sit a little farther back. I don't want to get wet." His laughter was loud and rude. A few of the campers looked around, but no one said a word. The girl blushed and tears welled up in her eyes, but she continued to stand as if stuck to the spot. Greg felt like a hero. He enjoyed humiliating her as if it was part of his plan. There was only one thing he didn't notice. At the other end of the pool, he was being watched. A look of restrained anger was directed directly at him. The one who was watching had already begun to rise slowly from his seat. The girl's name was Kiara, and she hated days like this. Every time the family went to the pool, she felt like a stranger in the world. Her mother, a tall and energetic woman with colorful clothes and a loud laugh, seemed like she was made for such places. Her younger brother, thin and agile, blended in easily with the other children. And Kiara, she felt ridiculous. The towel she clutched to her chest was more shield than comfort. It concealed her rounded figure, but it couldn't protect her from people's gazes. She saw them furtively, quick, appraising, judgmental. People didn't say anything out loud, but the expressions on their faces said more than words. Why is she so big? How did they even let it in here? She's probably the only one eating everything in the house. These thoughts followed her like shadows, even if no one said anything. Kiara walked along the hot concrete with her head down, trying to avoid making eye contact with anyone. She knew that if she looked in someone's direction, she would see disgust or mockery. As they approached the chaise lounges, Kiara's mother smiled and clapped her on the shoulder. "So, honey, shall we go in the water?" she asked enthusiastically. Kiara only nodded, avoiding a direct answer. She looked at the pool where children her age were playing carefree. It seemed the whole world was on the other side of that blue water, where she had no way to go. "Come on, sunshine," her mother encouraged her, not noticing her daughter's inner struggle. Kiara reluctantly began to remove the towel, and that's when she heard someone's loud laugh. She turned around sharply, seeing a man in shorts and a baseball cap. His eyes were burning through her, and the corners of his mouth curved up in a nasty grin. It was Greg. He wasn't trying to be inconspicuous. On the contrary, his loud voice was aimed at getting others to pay attention to the girl as well. "Who is this sea cow that has come ashore?" he said, deliberately loud enough to be heard. Kiara froze. Her hands instantly clutched at the towel, but it was too late. Several people turned around, and one of the teenagers near the pool giggled. Her face turned crimson. "She'll probably heat the water as soon as she gets in," Greg added, turning to someone sitting next to him. Kiara's mother was busy talking to other women and did not hear these words. Her brother was already in the water, busy with his games. She was left alone, humiliated and paralyzed. "Maybe we should put her on a scale first. We'll see if the pool holds up," he continued, and at that moment the laughter grew louder. Kiara lowered her head. She couldn't take it any more. Her eyes filled with tears, but she knew she shouldn't cry. Tears would only make things worse. "Just hang in there. Just be patient," she whispered. Kiara stood at the water's edge, her fingers nervously rubbing the edge of her towel. She tried to concentrate on the soft whisper of the water, on the children's voices, on anything to avoid hearing the hurtful words. But it was impossible. Greg's voice was like a poisonous needle that dug into her mind over and over again. "Hey, look who's here," Greg announced loudly, not bothering to use any caution at all. His voice echoed over the pool, and the chatter around him began to die down. "It seems we have a new member of the Olympic diving team." Kiara froze, her breathing quickening. She didn't dare look away, but she could feel the eyes of the campers on her. "You should have at least brought a life preserver," he continued with fake concern, squinting. "Wait, why do you need a life preserver? You're like a circle." The laughter hit her like a slap. Someone nearby chuckled. Kiara felt the ground beneath her feet turn to quicksand. She wanted to run away, to hide, to disappear into thin air, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the ground. "She probably eats more than she swims," Greg added, continuing his show. He was now supported by several teenagers sitting by the pool. One of them said loudly, "We should check the water in case it spills." Another explosion of laughter. Kiara could barely hold back her tears. Her face burned with shame. She felt every look piercing her, every whisper a knife. But the worst part was that no one stopped Greg. People just stared or pretended nothing was happening. Some turned away, some walked away quickly, but no one said a word to him. Greg was enjoying the attention. His smile was satisfied, like a man who had caught a goldfish. This was not just a moment for him. It was an opportunity to feel important, to show his superiority. "So, jump. What are you waiting for?" he continued. "We are bored here. Entertain us. Show us how you make waves." Kiara clenched her fists. She couldn't breathe anymore, couldn't think. All she wanted to do was run, but her body refused to move. She could feel her heart pounding loudly in her chest, ready to jump out. Meanwhile, Greg decided it was all too easy. He rose from his seat, heading toward her as if he were prey. His shadow fell on Kiara, making her feel even smaller. "Hey, I'm talking to you," he said, leaning in close to her face. "Or are you as dumb as you are fat?" That moment was the last straw. Tears streamed down her cheeks, but Greg only grinned. One thing, however, he did not notice. Just a few meters behind him, among the chaise lounges, a tall man rose slowly. His gaze was hard as steel. His dark eyes looked at Greg the way a lion looks at a jackal. He saw every humiliating phrase, every movement, and knew that the moment to intervene had come. The silence hanging in the air would soon be replaced by a storm. Kiara tried to take a step back, but her feet felt like they were stuck to the hot pool tiles. Greg, noticing her confusion, squared his shoulders and raised his voice so that everyone could hear him. His words flew at the girl like sharp knives, cutting through her defenses and plunging her into an abyss of shame. "Hey, have you ever even been in a pool?" he continued, his eyes glistening with pleasure. "Or were you banned? Afraid you'd clog the filters?" The words caused another explosion of laughter from the group of teenagers at the edge of the pool. They laughed openly, pointing their fingers at Kiara as if she were some kind of circus exhibit. One of them shouted, "Greg, look, if she jumps, we'll have to call 911. Isn't that what the buoys are for?" Greg turned to the teenager, giving an encouraging thumbs up. "Exactly. I think you could even call a boat, although she probably needs a boat to get in the water herself." The laughter grew louder, filling the entire pool. Now, even those who had been silent before began to whisper, pretending to discuss something else. And Kiara stood there, trying to cope with the overwhelming sense of humiliation. Her heart was pounding and her face was burning. She wanted to disappear, to vanish into thin air, to never see these people again. "Look at you." Greg stepped closer, his tone even more mocking, almost threatening. "Maybe you should lose a few pounds before you come in here in a bathing suit. Do you even know what you look like? It's a disgrace." His voice cut through the air. Kiara felt her legs shaking. She didn't dare look him in the eye. Everyone around her was silent. Even her mother and brother, busy with their own affairs, didn't know what was happening. But Greg wasn't going to stop. "You know what's funny?" He turned to the crowd. "They're all like that. They come here like it's their place. They think they can look any way they want, act any way they want, and all you and I have to do is put up with it. Isn't it comical?" The crowd was silent, but some people hummed or nodded. That was the worst part for Kiara. Not that Greg was talking, but that people didn't object. They watched, listened, laughed, some subtly, some openly, but no one stopped him. "Hey, maybe you should leave altogether," Greg threw down. "Go swimming in your own neighborhood. What are you doing here?" Kiara pressed her hands to her chest, as if trying to shield herself from all those words. Her shoulders slumped, and the tears flowed down her cheeks again. She couldn't hold them back any longer. But that only fueled Greg's fire. "Look, she's crying too," he shouted, making a pitiful face. "Maybe she's afraid of the water, although someone with that much weight has nowhere else to swim. We'll have to make a separate pool so she won't bother people." His cruelty seemed boundless. The laughter around them grew louder and louder, and Kiara felt less and less human. But at that moment, when the humiliation seemed to have peaked, something happened that Greg hadn't expected. Heavy footsteps sounded behind him, footsteps that could not be unheard. They carried with them something menacing, like approaching thunder. Greg, absorbed in his play, did not notice that all eyes turned to the man who was coming toward him. A moment later, a voice, deep as the murmur of the sea, broke through the noise. "Hey!" Greg turned around. There was still a smirk on his face, but it was instantly erased when he saw the man in front of him. Tall, muscular, with eyes that held cold anger. The man was looking at him as if he'd already decided his fate. There was silence. Now everyone was watching the two of them, holding their breath. The storm was coming. There was a disturbing silence in the air, broken only by the sound of the water and the occasional cries of children who had not yet noticed what was happening. The crowd of vacationers froze as if caught by surprise, but no one dared to interfere. Everyone looked at Kiara, at her crying face, at Greg, who had already begun to turn toward the man, and averted their eyes. "What? Someone else has something to say?" Greg looked around, his voice still confident, though there was a faint shadow of doubt in the depths of his eyes. A couple of women were sitting on neighboring loungers, pretending to be so engrossed in their conversation that they were oblivious to their surroundings. One of them, a slender blonde in a large sun umbrella, whispered, "Terrible, of course. But who are we to interfere?" Her interlocutor, an older woman, only nodded, shrugging her shoulders faintly. "Let them handle it. It's none of our business." Nearby, by the pool, the teenagers continued to giggle, occasionally nudging each other with their elbows. One of them, frowning, said quietly, "Will you stop it? This is too much." But his friend, a tall guy in brightly colored swim trunks, grinned. "Oh, come on. It's just a joke. She's asking for it. Look at her." It was as if this phrase gave them permission to continue. One of them shouted, "Hey, Greg, why don't you show her how to swim? Or does she need a separate pool?" The laughter broke out again, though it sounded strained now. Those who were laughing still glanced furtively at the tall man who stood behind Greg. His silence seemed louder than any shout. Across the pool, a middle-aged man in sunglasses set aside his newspaper and turned to his wife. "Do you see that?" he asked, frowning. "Yes," she answered briefly, biting her lip. "Well, I hope no one gets into a fight. That's not why we're here." "Sure," she agreed, looking away. Kiara, feeling the stares, was torn between the desire to hide and the dream that someone would stand up for her. Her mother, finally noticing that something was wrong, got up from the chaise lounge, but she was distracted by a random acquaintance talking to her about nothing. None of the adults approached. No one said a word. But worst of all was the person who sat closest to him, a man with black glasses and a strong build. He met Kiara's gaze, and then Greg's. His face remained indifferent. He just got up, slowly gathered his things, and left as if nothing had happened. "They're all like that," Greg continued, turning to the man who now stood behind him. "They think they can come here and take our place. Doesn't that piss you off?" He glanced at the man, hoping to find an ally in him, but his words met with no support. There was no response. The man only took a step forward, and Greg suddenly realized that the silence hanging around him was too ominous. His smug smile began to fade. The crowd was silent, absorbed in their indifference. The people who could have intervened chose the role of observers. They didn't want trouble. They didn't want to step out of their comfort zone. And this silence, cold and all-consuming, made Kiara's loneliness even more painful. The only sound now was her father's footsteps approaching Greg, and with each step, the world around them seemed to shrink. The crowd had no choice but to watch justice take its course, even if it came with fists. Shadows from large umbrellas moved leisurely across the tiles around the pool. People were talking, laughing, enjoying the cool water. In the midst of all this bustle was him, a tall, sturdy man with a short haircut and a serious face. His name was Jake. He was sitting on a chaise lounge, leaning back a little, drinking iced tea from a plastic cup. At first glance, he looked calm, almost detached, as if this day was no different for him. But his eyes. It was his eyes that gave away what Jake was feeling. Dark, deep. They were scrutinizing his surroundings as if scanning everything that was going on around them. Jake was not a man to interfere without reason. He was no stranger to patience, and he believed in discretion. But he also knew his boundaries, and now he could feel those boundaries beginning to crumble. He'd noticed Greg from the moment he'd sat down nearby. He'd seen the way the man was sizing up the people around him with contempt, with superiority, with a look that Jake knew all too well. Years of life had taught him to recognize such men instantly. They always started the same way, with mockery, with jokes that grew harsher and harsher until someone stopped the farce. He didn't immediately realize that his daughter, Kiara, was the subject of this man. Jake's attention was focused on the book he was holding, but his intuition told him to look up the moment Greg made the first loud comment. Jake immediately noticed the change in the atmosphere. The laughter, the whispering, the silence. It was all too familiar. He put the book aside and looked toward the pool. His eyes immediately caught the figure of his daughter. Kiara stood at the water's edge, frozen like a statue. Her shoulders were slumped, her head bowed, and her hands were frantically rubbing the towel. But most of all, his heart clenched when he saw her face. Tears streamed down her cheeks and her lips trembled as if she was trying to say something but couldn't. Around her, like predators, taunts circled her. They came from Greg, from the teenagers at the pool, even from some of the adults who only smirked or turned away to stay out of it. Every comment, every derogatory joke hit her like rocks. Greg kept talking. His voice grew louder and his words became harsher. Now he was not even trying to disguise his racism. His phrases were openly angry, openly humiliating. "Look at her," he shouted, pointing his finger at Kiara. "They're always like this, aren't they? They come here, take our place, and then wonder why no one likes them." Laughter filled the air again. It was a sound that felt like it hit Jake in the chest. He stood up, slowly, without moving, but his figure attracted immediate attention. The people sitting around him felt a change in the atmosphere. Those who were still laughing suddenly fell silent when they noticed him. Greg, absorbed in his show, had not yet seen what was going on behind him. Jake stepped forward, his boots thudding on the tile. Outwardly, he was still calm, but inside he was seething. He saw his daughter cringe, her lips moving as if she wanted to say something, but the words stuck in her throat. He saw people turn away, pretending nothing was happening. This indifference, this fear of interfering, this acquiescence to what Greg was doing, was worse for Jake than any words. When he was close enough to hear Greg's every word, he stopped. His voice, deep and low, sounded like the roar of thunder. "Are you done?" Greg flinched and turned around. When he saw Jake, his face changed for a moment. The smug grin disappeared, giving way to a look of mild surprise, but he pulled himself together quickly. "Who are you?" he asked, folding his arms across his chest. "You want to play hero?" Jake took another step forward, and Greg suddenly realized how tall and strong the man was. His muscular figure, his confident gaze, made it clear that he wasn't just some random person. "I'm her father," Jake said, his voice quiet but threatening, and the others stepped back. And I want to know what you think you're doing, giving yourself the right to humiliate my daughter." The crowd around them froze. All eyes were on the two of them. Greg felt a drop of sweat trickle down his temple. But he wasn't going to back down. He was used to being humiliated, used to his words going unpunished. "Come on," he said, trying to regain his smugness. "Just a little humor. It's not my fault that... Well, you can see for yourself." Jake took another step forward, and now his face was level with Greg's. His eyes were no longer calm. There was steel in his eyes, cold and unyielding. "Apologize," he said. His voice was quiet, but every word sounded like an order. Greg laughed, but that laugh was nervous. "Apologize? For what? It's not like she's even trying to do anything. They're always like that. All they can do is whine and complain." Greg's words hung in the air. Jake didn't move, but his fists clenched. The crowd fell silent again, sensing that the moment of truth was near. Every next word could be the spark for a real storm. Greg looked at Jake from head to toe, trying to maintain a semblance of confidence, but there was a note of irritation in his voice. He hadn't expected anyone to stand up for the girl. His usual scenario always worked. A few taunts, the crowd laughs, and the victim walks away humiliated and broken. But now he was facing a man who clearly had no intention of backing down. That fact angered Greg. He decided to redouble his efforts to regain control of the situation. "Oh, I see," he said with a wry grin, glancing at Jake. "You're her father? Well, that explains a lot. I can see where she got that build. Sounds like you both like to overeat." Kiara, still standing at the edge of the pool, felt a new surge of humiliation shoot through her. She tried to clench even tighter, to hide behind her hands, but there was nowhere to go. Her father didn't respond to Greg's words. He just kept looking at him, and that silence seemed scarier than any scream. Greg, however, noticing that no one was answering, took that as a signal to move on. "You know what the funny thing is?" he continued loudly, now addressing the crowd. "They're always playing the victim. There she stands, all miserable, like it's our fault she looks like that. Maybe instead of complaining, she should run. Or, I don't know, stop eating everything." The crowd froze, but no one said a word. The teenagers by the pool giggled again, and the sound seemed to break the silence. Greg was inspired by their encouragement. He stepped closer to Kiara, his voice even louder for all to hear. "Do you even know what that looks like? You came in here like this is your place. But you know what? You and your kind, you're just messing things up. We work, we create, and all you can do is sit on welfare and complain about life." These words were like thunder. Some people in the crowd gasped, but no one moved. Greg continued, his voice growing harsher and more venomous. "I just want you to know that you're a stranger here. You're not welcome here. You, your family, all of you, you're just a burden that you'd rather be rid of. And if you don't like what I'm saying, well, I'm sorry. The truth can be unpleasant." Kiara couldn't hold back any longer. The tears she'd been trying to hold back for so long rolled down her cheeks. She felt her throat constrict and the world around her begin to blur. Greg noticed this and smiled, pleased with its effect. To him, it was confirmation of victory. "See?" he said, turning to the crowd. "She's even crying. Like that's going to change anything. Crying is easier than changing yourself, isn't it?" Jake had been as still as a statue the whole time, but now his eyes flashed with cold fire. He took a step forward, and at that moment the air around him seemed to freeze. People who had been snickering or watching indifferently a second ago instinctively fell silent. Even Greg felt it. He turned to Jake, trying to maintain his smug smile, but his voice shook slightly. "What? Do you have something to say? Or are you the kind of guy who just stares and stares?" Jake stepped so close that their faces were only a few inches apart. His voice was low and threatening, but at the same time impeccably calm. "Are you done?" Greg took a step back, trying to hold on to what was left of his confidence, but Jake didn't give him a chance to get away. He leaned closer, his words echoing in the silence. "You don't even realize what you just did." The crowd froze. There came a moment when all the tension that had been building up was ready to explode. Greg tried to smile, but it came out strained. He realized that something had changed, and that something was standing right in front of him, not allowing him to hide behind the mask of words. Jake stood still, his figure a monolith against the chaos that was unfolding around him. He watched Greg with the predatory stamina that only people accustomed to confrontation have. He saw every detail, the smug smile on Greg's face, the way he put his hands behind his head, chest heaving in a gesture of superiority, and the way his words continued to cut like blades. "You probably think this is your moment of glory, don't you?" Greg said loudly, turning to Jake when he noticed him heading toward him. "Decided to come out as an advocate, like in a cheap movie? I don't know who you are, but from the looks of you, you're no better. Just like her." The crowd went quiet again. Greg clearly felt safe behind his words. He was used to people preferring to avoid conflict. To him, words were a weapon that always went unpunished. He turned to the crowd, expecting support. "Look at that. He thinks he can intimidate me. I wonder if it runs in the family to think they can do anything." Jake kept walking forward. His steps were slow, almost lazy, but they felt strong. He didn't look at Kiara anymore, not because he didn't care about her, but because he'd already made his choice. Greg was no longer just an unpleasant man. He was now a threat, and a threat that needed to be eliminated. When Jake stopped a few feet away from Greg, he didn't say a word. His gaze, heavy and penetrating, was stronger than any answer. Greg sensed it, but decided not to show his discomfort. Instead, he smirked and added, trying to maintain a semblance of control. "What? You're quiet? Is it hard to talk with your mouth? Or maybe you don't even know what I'm talking about. Let me guess, you're the kind of guy who thinks everyone owes him a favor." Typical story. Greg turned to the crowd that was watching. Some of them tried to look away, while others were mesmerized. But no one interfered. No one made a single step to stop him. "I'll tell you what," he continued, raising his hand and pointing at Jake. "These people are always like this. They think they're allowed to do anything. They come into our pools, our stores, our schools, and they act like it's their right. But it's not their place. It's not for them." The words came like a slap, breaking the silence. Jake's gaze grew even colder, but he still showed no emotion. Greg made another attempt. "Hey, maybe you just want me to apologize?" He laughed, his voice full of sarcasm. "Well, here's an apology. I'm sorry you and your family exist." The crowd gasped. Even those who had been giggling or acquiescing felt that Greg had gone too far. But Greg, engrossed in his performance, continued. "It's true. If you don't like the way you're being treated, maybe you should think about why. Maybe it's not us. Maybe it's you." Jake finally took a step forward. His movements were slow, but every one of them spoke of absolute control over the situation. He was right in front of Greg, who, despite his smugness, instinctively took half a step back. Now Jake spoke. His voice was low, calm, but each phrase sounded like a thunderclap. Do you think you can say whatever you want and no one will answer? Do you think your words mean nothing? Greg, trying to hide his nervousness, snorted. What are you gonna do? You can't shut me up. I have the right to say what I think. Jake nodded, as if in agreement. He tilted his head slightly to the side as if studying the man in front of him. Right? He repeated. You're talking about a right? What about my daughter's right to be here without your insults? Or the right to just be happy without hearing your filthy words? Greg opened his mouth to respond, but Jake held up his hand, stopping him. The gesture was so sure that Greg froze, not knowing how to respond. You can think whatever you want. That's your right, Jake continued. But when you cross the line, you're no longer just a person with an opinion. You become a problem, and problems need to be solved. The crowd watched with bated breath. The tension was so thick it could be felt physically. Jake was calm, but there was a formidable strength in that calmness. He stood in front of Greg without showing an ounce of fear, and even the smug Greg was beginning to realize that he was facing something he hadn't expected. Greg stood across from Jake, shifting nervously from foot to foot. His self-confidence was slowly melting away, like ice in the hot sun. Just a moment ago, he'd felt like the master of the situation, but now something was different. The silence that hung around him pressed harder than any noise. Even his own words, which had sounded loud and confident before, now stuck in his throat. But he was still trying to keep up his mark. Well, what are you going to do? He said, trying to put confidence into his voice, but his tone shook. Are you going to lecture me? Will you show me what a great father you are? Jake took his time answering. His face remained impenetrable, but there was a glint of steel in his eyes. The crowd around him watched his every move tensely. Even those who had been silent up to that point sensed that something important was about to happen. Do you really want to know who I am? Jake finally spoke, his voice low and calm, like the sound of the surf before a storm. Okay, I'll tell you. He stepped forward, closing the distance between them even further. Now Greg could see every vein in his tense arms, every wrinkle in his face, which looked unthreatening but still respectful. I'm Jake Wilson, he began, and his words sounded like a challenge. You probably haven't heard of me, but I'm a professional boxer. 12 years in the ring, 7 championship titles, and I've seen more arrogant people than you can imagine. Greg blinked, trying to maintain his courage, but his eyes flicked around, searching for confirmation. The crowd began to whisper. Someone already recognized the name. A man sitting next to his family whispered to his wife, "Is that him? The Jake Wilson? I saw his fight with Marcus Reed. He took him down in the 3rd round." The whispers grew like a wave until they covered the entire pool. People were beginning to realize who stood before them. Even the teenagers who had been giggling a moment ago now froze, sensing that the situation was taking a dangerous turn. You think you can say whatever you want? Jake continued, his voice getting harder. You think you're strong because you can humiliate a girl? You think that makes you a better man? But I'll tell you something, Greg. I've seen real strength, real courage, and it sure as hell ain't you. Greg opened his mouth to reply, but Jake held up his hand, stopping him. I've trained with the best fighters in the world. I know what respect is, and I know what fear is. And I can see in your eyes that you're feeling both right now. You talk about rights, about who's the outsider, but you know what? The only stranger here is you. You're standing here humiliating my child because it's the only way you can feel important. The crowd began to whisper louder. The atmosphere was heating up. People who'd been silent a while ago were talking, and some of them were nodding in agreement with Jake. Greg tried to say something, but the words wouldn't come out. His confidence had completely evaporated. He realized that the situation was out of his control. His lips tightened, and he started to back away, but Jake wouldn't let him go. "Not so fast," he said, his voice turning icy. "You think you can just walk away? You humiliated my daughter in front of all those people. You made her cry. And you think I'm going to let you just disappear?" Greg froze, his face pale. He glanced at the crowd, but there were no allies there. Even those who had supported him with laughter were now looking at him with judgment. "You wanted a show?" Jake stepped closer, his voice louder now. "You got it. But this show ends the way I say it ends. And remember, Greg, sometimes words can be more dangerous than fists because they leave scars that don't heal." Greg couldn't take it anymore. He lowered his gaze, his shoulders slumped. The crowd was silent, stunned by the reversal of roles. The one who'd been humiliated was now humiliated himself. Jake, still in control, turned slowly toward his daughter, holding out his hand to her. "You're stronger than you think," he told her softly, but so that everyone could hear him. "And no words can change that." This moment was a turning point. The crowd finally realized that it was not just a conflict that had taken place before their eyes. It was a victory over evil, over hatred, over the weakness that hides behind cruel words. Greg stood there, trying to keep his dignity, but his whole look said he was afraid. He knew that Jake wasn't the kind of man who would let him just walk away. The crowd around him seemed to merge into one huge, breathless creature. Everyone froze, waiting for the next move. "You probably think you can just say whatever you want and walk away, don't you?" Jake said, his voice calm, but there was something threatening in that calm. "That words aren't worth anything? Let me show you how it really works." Greg tried to feign confidence, though his knees trembled slightly. "Are you serious? You want to settle this with your fists?" He grinned, trying to hide his fear. "This is a pool, not your ring." "You're right," Jake agreed. "But sometimes words aren't enough. Sometimes you have to answer for them." He stepped forward, and Greg instinctively stepped back, tripping over the edge of the chaise. His grin disappeared and panic appeared in his eyes. He tried to hide behind the words. "It's just a joke, you know," he said, looking at Jake. "You're not going to—" "I didn't mean it like that." "A joke?" Jake squinted, his fist clenched slowly, as if he were about to test what the words really meant. "A joke is when everyone's laughing. But you were the only one laughing here." He grabbed Greg by the collar of his shirt and pulled him to his feet. The people around him gasped, but no one dared intervene. Jake lifted Greg up so that he was barely touching the ground with the toes of his shoes and looked him straight in the eye. "Do you like to humiliate people?" he asked coldly. "Do you feel powerful when someone is victimized? Let me show you what real strength is." Jake threw Greg to the ground, and he collapsed ridiculously, slipping on the wet tiles. The crowd recoiled, but no one tried to stop Jake. Even the pool staff, who usually kept order, didn't rush to intervene. Greg tried to get up, but Jake was faster. He grabbed his arm and jerked him to his feet. "Hit me," Jake said, calmly unclenching his fingers and giving Greg a chance to defend himself. "Come on, show me what you can do. Show me you've got something other than words." Greg swung, but his blow was weak and awkward. Jake deflected easily, and his fist shot forward, meeting Greg's stomach with a thud. He bent in half, letting out a hoarse groan, but Jake didn't let him fall. He held him like a doll that couldn't fight back. "This is just the beginning," he said, his voice low, but everyone in the crowd heard him. "I want you to remember this moment. I want you to realize that every word you say has consequences." He turned Greg around and pushed him toward the pool. He slipped, waving his arms absurdly, and fell into the water with a loud splash. For a moment, silence filled the air again, but when Greg surfaced, gasping and clutching at the edge, people began to whisper. Jake walked to the edge of the pool and leaned over, his shadow falling on Greg. "Did you want to humiliate?" he asked. "Now you know how it feels. If I hear you say things like that again, I won't be so kind. Do you understand me?" Greg, coughing and spitting up water, nodded, but Jake didn't back down. "I can't hear it." "Yes, yes," Greg shouted, his voice hoarse, frightened. "I got it." Jake straightened, turned to the crowd, and met his gaze with everyone who looked at him. His eyes burned with cold fire, making everyone feel ashamed of their silence. Then he held out his hand to his daughter. Kiara, still shocked, took it, and together they left the place where fear and humiliation had finally been replaced by justice. The crowd was left standing in silence, realizing that they had just witnessed something that would not be forgotten for a long time. Greg was still clinging to the edge of the pool, his breathing hoarse and his face pale with fear and humiliation. Water dripped from his hair and clothes, leaving wet patches around him. He no longer looked like the cocky man who moments ago had loudly proclaimed his right to humiliate others. His gaze darted from face to face in the crowd, but no one rushed to come to his aid. His allies, those who used to laugh with him, now averted their eyes. They no longer wanted to be a part of this spectacle. Jake stood at the edge of the pool, looking down at Greg. His breathing was even, and there was no more rage in his eyes, only cold determination. He turned to the crowd, his gaze like a spotlight on everyone in the room. "You all saw what happened here," he said, his voice deep and calm, but with a steely hardness. "You all heard what he said. You heard him humiliate my child. And what did you do?" The crowd was silent. No one dared to answer. People averted their eyes, some pretended to look at their phones, others just stood there, as if chained to a spot. "Nothing," Jake continued, his voice louder. "You did nothing. You stood there, listening to an innocent child being abused, and you just watched. Some of you even laughed. Do you know what that means?" He paused, letting his words settle in the minds of everyone present. "It means you've become a part of it. Your silence made you as guilty as his words." Kiara stood beside him, her eyes still red from crying, but there was something new in them. Her father was protecting her, and that gave her the strength to stand up straight, despite the pain she felt. She no longer hid behind the towel, no longer tried to disappear. She looked at those who had once laughed, and their gazes now avoided her. Jake turned back to Greg, who still couldn't lift his head. "You like to talk about rights," Jake said, his voice icy, "but everyone has a right to be here, not just you. My daughter has as much right to swim in this pool as anyone else, and no one, including you, can take that away." Greg didn't answer. He huddled against the edge, his face a look of humiliation and fear. He made no more excuses, knowing that every word he said would only make things worse. "Now, listen to me, all of you," Jake said to the crowd. "The next time you see something like this, you're either going to side with justice or you're going to be just like him. Indifference is not neutrality. It is a choice to be on the side of the oppressor. Jake's words pierced the air like lightning. Some of the people in the room lowered their heads, realizing their guilt. Others nodded silently, their faces in agreement, but no one objected, because deep down they all knew he was right. Jake put his arm around Kiara's shoulders, turned, and started to walk away. The crowd parted before him, as if paying their respects. They were silent, but there was a mixture of shame and gratitude in their eyes. As they neared the exit, Kiara looked at her father and said quietly, "Thanks, Dad." "Always sunshine," he replied, squeezing her shoulder. Behind them there was a crowd of people, each of whom learned a lesson. Some thought about their actions, some vowed never to be silent again. Some realized how important it is to protect those who cannot protect themselves. And Greg, still wet and humiliated, realized that his words no longer had any power. Today had taught him a lesson he would remember for the rest of his life. Words have consequences, and sometimes you have to answer for them. Friends, what do you think of this story? Share your thoughts in the comments. It would be interesting to know how you feel about it. Have you experienced racism or injustice in your life? How have you dealt with it? Your stories are important to us, and we'd love to read each and every one. If you liked it, be sure to give it a like and subscribe to our channel so you don't miss out on such powerful stories that touch on important topics and inspire thought. We appreciate each of you and want to thank you for being with us. May your day be kind, fair, and filled with warmth.